Welcome back, everybody. It's Mark with exoticcarplayplace, and today we're standing in front of one of my most favorite cars, hypercar, supercar, premium luxury car, one of the finest luxury cars by BMW and by any premium brand available today, the E60 M5. And really, I'm making this video because why would I buy one of the most unreliable BMWs on the market today? Now, we're talking about two gentlemen that have created videos recently. One, of course, Doug DeMuro created a video last week he reviewed this exact same car, an E60 M5, and he really talked over and over about how unreliable it was. Sure, he discussed some of the fun side of the drive, of course, and the performance, but he really, the heavy emphasis was on the unreliability and the fact that nobody could possibly want to buy one of these cars. And then along comes one of his cohorts, another gentleman by the name of Hoovies Garage. He came and did a discussion on the same car. His was more of a burgundy color, of course, but he picked up the cheapest E60 M5 that was running, and he was walking us through one of his experiences about getting this thing back up to speed because his car had a host of issues. Now, before we get into that, did you notice in Hoovies' video, shortly after he started the car up, revved it hard, and then set off? And how do you know it was cold? Well, he talked about the car being cold, of course, as he was driving along, because it would shift when it was cold, but it wouldn't shift very well when it was hot. So that brings us to the point of why these cars are so unreliable. Yeah, we know these cars have exceptional performance. Yes, they have the S85, the glorious V10 engine, the S85 motor that is equipped under here. It's a nicely balanced 90-degree V10 that produces up to 507 brake horsepower. And with all that power, it's still able to accommodate with strong brakes and a transmission that when you shift it up to the most aggressive shift speed is able to interrupt it in between shifts. It's a great package that's also known to do over 200 miles per hour. So that is essentially why I bought this unreliable BMW. Now, we all know that they're not reliable. We have Vanos problems. We have differential issues, rod bearing problems. There's a whole host of things. But let's talk about that for a moment, and then I'm going to go talk to my mechanic. He's one of the best engine builders that I know in town. We're going to do a swing by his shop, and we're going to ask him some specific questions why he believes the rod bearings are wearing out prematurely on these cars. So, of course, we've got the V10. It's absolutely stunning engine in here. Now, of course, you need brakes like that. Look at the size of those brakes. These things here are capable enough to stop this thing, bring it to a halt in short time. The only thing that I found with my car, now we talk about how unreliable these things are. Honestly, and I know this is me knocking on wood, but hey, you know what? I really haven't had a lot of issues. Now, I don't have a lot of miles on my car. The only thing I've noticed, if you look at the back end of the car, the tires, I had premature wear on the inside edges of both my rears, which would suggest a heavy camber, negative camber, and actually you can kind of see that a little bit. The way the tires are sort of sloped outwards a bit, that is the general setup of the suspension, and that's what partially helps this thing handle so well. Even for a car that weighs like 4,000 pounds, those brakes and those suspension setup allows this car to perform like a much lighter, smaller, more nimbler vehicle. So really what it comes down to, if we talk reliability, the rear tires, you will eat lots of rear tires on this car for sure. There's no doubt about it. With 500 horsepower plus, you're going to chew the rear tires, not to mention the camber setup. The fronts as well, you're going to have issues with that. Naturally, hard turn in. When you're trying to turn in a 4,000 pound car, fronts are going to wear quickly too. So let's talk about some of the things that I have experienced as well. Inside this beautiful machine, of course, it is holding up exceptionally well. Exceptionally. I put this junky cover on here just to protect the seat a bit, but the wear and tear in this thing is so minimal that, you know, I've got to think that is a very well constructed vehicle. So in terms of reliability and durability, the interior of the car and the exterior body panels and everything holds up very, very well. So I'm just going to walk you through a couple of the things that I experienced. So let's pop the hood. And there it is, the glorious V10. 507 brake horsepower tucked away under there. So what have I experienced on this thing? Well, underneath all of this plastic, you have your individual throttle bodies that run in a V here. You've got 5 on either side, and way tucked down in beneath there, you also have the throttle actuators. I have had, in fact, throttle actuator failure on this car. I've had mine fail. It spit out a code, put the car into limp mode, and it drops the RPMs all the way down, basically like a cold start, and reduces power dramatically. You actually find it very difficult to even get up to 50, 60 kilometers per hour. So I had those throttle actuators fail on me. Now what I haven't had is any issue, and again, knocking on wood, Vanos issues, which are essentially tucked away in here. That's your variable valve timing. I haven't had issues there, but that is another known problem here, and people get scared of that. People also get scared with all the modules and electronics that allow this car to run. That scares people away. The big thing that scares people away with these cars are the rod bearings, which you don't see from here because this is the top end of the motor. The rod bearings you would find you'd have to go underneath, and so they're actually changeable without pulling the engine. As long as you don't let them wear out to the point of catastrophic failure, you get the car up, you take all the junk off the bottom, including the oil pan, and then you have full access to the rod bearings. You can change them out for a relatively decent dollar. Not a huge expense, relatively speaking. And so when we talk about reliability, like I said, a lot of people get freaked out by the idea of spending all this money on rod bearings and throttle actuators and modules and you name it, SMG pumps, and all that kind of stuff, Vanos lines, things that can pop, burst, leak oil, or whatever. So a lot of people get scared. They get scared of these cars, and that's why a lot of these cars are going for $15,000, $17,000, $20,000, when in reality this car was $130,000 Canadian, or around 90 to 100 grand US would buy you a car like this back in the day. A lot of people don't want it now because they're scared of the rod bearings and the throttle actuators and all the other jazz. But why are people so scared? That is my question about all of this. Think about all the electronic modules, things that fail. Yes, that fails. But what do you think all the modern cars are doing? Look at modern BMWs. Look at even modern Lexuses and Audis. All the electronic digital dashboards, the traction aids, all of the protective systems that keep you lane assist and adaptive cruise control. What do you think all those systems do? Eventually, those systems are going to fail as well. And so once you get past all those other electronic ancillary bits, and you quit justifying the reason not to buy one of these cars, the reality is, like I said, a lot of the modern cars have far more complex systems that will eventually leave them in the lurch as well. So that really boils down to what? The SMG transmission, which can be lurchy. Of course, the pump is not inexpensive, and some of the lines can be a bit pricey. Throttle actuators are a bit pricey, but they're an easy fix. It's, you pull the intake off, you do a quick 1-2, and away you go. A couple grand here, a couple grand there, but they don't go every day. It's not something that you eat them for lunch by any means. The big thing here, the big question, are the rod bearings. Why are they failing, and how can you prevent that? So at the end of the day, rod bearings, treat them like a maintenance item. Why would you worry about rod bearings? So you have to do rod bearings every 100,000 kilometers, maybe every 120,000 kilometers. Maybe you do. So that's a $4,000 or $5,000 touch every 5, 6, 7 years, depending on how many kilometers you put on your car. That's a relatively minor cost. The bigger factor here, of course, is the general maintenance. Yeah, oil changes are important. Warm-up time is important on this. But you know what? Every car requires maintenance, and maybe that's why they're looking at alternative methods of power, like electric cars and hybrid, for example, because these aren't that efficient, and they aren't without breakdowns and repairs. But at the end of the day, you've got a real performance machine here that isn't really that bad. Yeah, it has a lot of things that can go on it, but the reality is Are all those things failing on them on a regular basis? As I mentioned, Vanos pumps, throttle actuators, rod bearings. Those are the big ones that you're going to worry about the most in this car. But you'll notice, before I go to talk to my mechanic, you see I've got this great new shirt. I've got lots of merchandise. If you want to get in on some of that, you make sure you check out the channel store below and the link down in the description. You'll find a link, it'll take you right to the store. If you're interested in supporting the channel and keep things going, so as I talked about, I made a reference to Hoovies garage, and right at this point where he started his car, he proceeded to rev the engine really hard. Now I'd say Hoovies definitely has a lot of great experience in cars, but that's one of the examples of the things that I want to talk about why some of these engines are failing, is because people are not giving adequate warm-up time when they start the car cold. They get in, they start chasing off and start driving the car hard, because the general feel is when you get behind the wheel, you want to drive it like that. So doing that is a problem because the rod bearings are not fully lubricated yet. So you've got an oil pump that's pumping oil into the whole engine. A lot of it goes into between the space between the rod bearings and the journals, and it goes through a lot of other places within the engine. The problem is, when you start an engine cold, you can see pressures up to 90, 95 PSI, and it's that high pressure that causes damage to the engine, because that pressure is two things. Number one, it's the back pressure that you're reading in the engine because the oil is not able to flow through easily, so the back pressure is being read. So the pressure goes very high on a cold engine. Now as the engine warms up, the oil flows easier as it becomes warmer, and as a result, that oil pressure drops. So on a hot engine, if you've been driving on the freeway, that engine can actually drop down at idle to lower than 30 PSI from 90 PSI when it was a cold start. That's a pretty big differential. That 90 PSI is what's actually taking a toll on the bearings, because it's actually eroding edges of the bearings. And as well, you don't have enough flow, adequate flow between the bearings or the return out of the bearings. So you don't have the proper cooling and you don't have the proper lubrication when you're using a heavy 10W60 oil that is spec'd for these cars. So warm-up time is absolutely critical. Now there's people out there that have done some great things, and they've actually plumbed in oil pressure switches and gauges into the car. Now some guys have done it aftermarket, and they've mounted a gauge by AEM, like an AEM style gauge, got the hoses and all the lines, and run that down to the oil filter housing, which is located at the front right corner of the engine. Now there's a fitting there, or there's a takeoff there, and if you buy the right fitting, you can adapt that, take it to your AEM gauge, which you can locate anywhere in the car. One good spot, popular spot, happens to be in the glove compartment, and it allows you to monitor that oil pressure. Because you see, when a car is cold, the pressure is very, very high. That is a great indicator, not just the gauge on the tachometer that shows you where the red line is, but actually the oil pressure gauge is going to be a great indicator to tell you when the oil is adequately warmed up. If you're running at 60, 70, 80, 90 PSI at 2000 RPM or even at idle, that's way too high a pressure. So number one, that could be an issue with too thick of an oil. But number two, if it's just flat out cold outside, give the car time to warm up. Let's go check out my mechanic, have a discussion with him, and see what his take is on this whole rod bearing and oil weight thing issue is with these M5s. So let's go. you know about, when we're talking about rod bearings and very, very tight tolerances that you normally find in the E60 M5s, how would that impact wear and tear on the bearings? Why do you think rod bearings are wearing out so fast on those cars?
Well, I think there's a few reasons. One of them is too thick of an oil, and also too long between oil changes, and also not letting the engine warm up. Because you should always let the engine oil warm up before you take off with the car. Because too thick of an oil grabs it and it causes friction. When the oil is too thick, right? It grabs it. It sort of wants to stop the crank from turning. And then what it does is create a lot of heat, and that wears the bearings out really fast.
Okay.
Too thick of an oil.
Okay.
The thinner the oil, the better it is. The looser the guides and looser parts, like, tolerances,
the rods
is better.
Rod
Loose
bearings.
is good, tight is no good.
Okay. So the fact that BMW specs a 10W60 would
That's
suggest
too thick. Way too thick.
Way too thick.
Way too thick. 0-40, like now I would run 0-40.
Yeah?
Absolutely. That's way too thick.
Yeah. Okay, so 1060 is way too thick.
Absolutely.
You're thinking 0-4 would be more the weight.
Yeah.
And I noticed when, I've seen a lot of people talk, and maybe you know a little more about this, when an engine's cold on a day like this, we're about 32 Fahrenheit or about 0 degrees C out there, an engine on a cold start, often you can see oil pressures up close to 90, almost to 100 PSI.
Absolutely, yeah. That's why they have the pressure release valve to relieve the pressure.
Okay.
Or else the oil filter will blow up.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so when a car warms up and it's thoroughly warm, you're running hard on the freeway, maybe on the track, whatever, even if it's cold outside ambient, what ends up happening is that oil pressure naturally, because the oil thins out, it gets warm, it gets more viscous, and it's happier, really, essentially. That oil flows better, and the overall pressure drops dramatically down to probably 30, 35 PSI.
And that's fine. That's even lots.
Yeah.
That's even lots.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's fine. Nothing wrong with that.
So that's proof that
Thin
cold oil is bad.
Yeah. When the engine's cold, the oil's like molasses. You
Yeah.
pour it, it's like molasses. That's no good.
Yeah.
That's no good. You want thin oil. Because when you first start your car, that's the most critical time. Because then the pump is pumping. By the time it gets to the top of the head, and all the holes are very small. Here, this is that vulva, right? Look how small the oil holes are, right? Where are they? See?
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, so thick oil just does not move. And so if you were to give some advice for people looking to try to prolong the life of the engine on these E60s, what would you say? What are the key principles?
Well, the first thing is warm up. Because a lot of people, they're not car people. They just go to work and they want to get to work. You got to warm up the car before. And I'm not saying warm it up for half an hour, an hour. Just a few minutes, just to let the oil thin out and everything warm up. The piston rings warm up. The pistons are warm.
How many times have you seen people? They start their car and they floor. You can hear rod knock and all kinds of weird noises coming in the engine.
Yeah. Then what happens then is the top rings break because nothing can expand. It's so cold, The materials have to get warm up because they got to expand. And then the oil's like molasses. The oil's not even to the heads yet, and they're revving the piss out. That's horrible. Horrible. Yeah, the oil changes have to be done regularly, and they have to be done between 4,000 to 5,000 kilometers, not more than that. I wouldn't go more than 5. Between 4 and 5 is max. Good light oil, quality oil, light. Like nowadays, a lot of cars are running 0-20. The Lambos, right? 0-40 is factory. It's
that's a
light
dry sump engine.
Light oils, good oil change on time, not more than, like I say, not more than 4 to 5.
Yeah.
Right? And warm up the engine before you go, and they'll be fine.
Okay.
You gotta let the engine warm up a little bit. A lot of people you see, they start the car, they put in drive, and they go, and it's minus 20 outside.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Wow.
Yeah, it's horrible.
Yeah,
horrible.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks, Ed. I want to thank you for that advice. And thanks, everybody out there. It's Mark again checking out, of course. I hope that gives you guys something to think about with the E60 M5. and why I decided to buy an E60 M5 knowing that there were reliability issues. Of course we know there are, but it's just that type of car. It's a little bit more precision in terms of technology in that car. You just have to know how to take care of it. And as Ed says here, there's just certain precautions you want to exercise. Outside of that, enjoy the car. Maintain it, drive it hard, and have fun. So hope everybody liked the video. Make sure you give it a thumbs up, like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And I hope to see you guys real soon. Talk to you then. Bye-bye.